I'm happy to see the faces on this panel. If I have not met you, I've certainly quoted your work at times, and I welcome all the participants to today's conference. As Flores mentioned, my name is April Pride, and what he didn't mention about my bio that I think uniquely situates me to moderate today's panel is I am a graduate of architecture school, and I have my master's from Parsons School of Design. And obviously, I am a woman. Today's panel, as he mentioned, is Psychedelics and Empathic Design, a Female Perspective. Before we introduce the panelists, I just want to set up today's panel. I think we all know that psychedelics have a unique ability to enhance empathy, inspiring designs that can transform not only individual lives, but also our collective societal structures. And today we'll explore this through the lens of female perspectives. And females are a consumer that I have focused on in both cannabis and psychedelics since 2015. We're diving into how these insights can lead to more compassionate and inclusive innovations. So I would like for the panelists to introduce themselves, and we're going to go in alphabetical order. We'll start with Jennifer Chesak, a woman that I've had the opportunity to work with on several occasions.
Always a pleasure, April. Thank you so much. And thanks for moderating this panel. You're perfect for it. I'm Jennifer Chesak, and I'm a science and medical journalist, and I wrote the psilocybin handbook for women. And that came out in 2023. And I just want to give a shout out to Mikaela, who's also on this panel, whom I interviewed for it. And I am just so grateful for not only the wisdom that you provided, but also sharing your beautiful personal experiences, which help bring an element of storytelling to the space. So thank you so much.
Mikaela, if you could introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is Mikaela Myco. I'm a mother, a mushroom educator, community organizer, grassroots researcher who's been very interested in filling some gaps that I've been noticing here in the entheogen space, notably as it affects and impacts mothers and the gap available to mothers seeking out insights, information, and kind of a roadmap for how to navigate psychedelic motherhood and parenting. And so that's birthed the Mothers of the Mushroom Research Project. I'm very grateful that website is launching, and with the help of a lot of community members. And yes, thank you, Jennifer, for also putting me on and making me a part of your incredible book. Another gap that I've been seeing in this space is the conversation around sensual harm in our community. And so advocacy, visibilizing stories of when things go wrong is very important, and then creating some preventative measures. And we've been doing that through the Matriarchal Alliance for Accountability and Transparency. There are many other projects, but I will just leave it at that. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, I'll hop in here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Amazing. Yeah, so happy to be here. Thanks for having me. My name's Tiffany Hurd, and just a little bit more about my background to build upon what Flores had shared. I have a 15-year background in the corporate medical industry, and like most people, really did not want to stay in that industry. And about 7 years ago, started working with psychedelics and entered the space supporting clients with microdosing and teaching them how to work with microdosing, and started facilitating the work along the path, and really missed that business background that I had, but of course did not want to go back into the industry. And so started to really think about how can I bridge and mold and really harmonize both of these spaces. And that's what I'm doing today, is working with teams and working with leaders, specifically with companies who are driving innovative strategies and sustainability for humanity. So it's not just an average tech company that's doing something that's harmful for the environment. It's more so specifically working with companies that are change makers, making a difference in our world, and bringing in psychedelics for them to really accelerate their companies personally, professionally, and really within a healthy team environment as well. So yeah, really looking forward to the conversation today.
Great. Thank you, all of you, so much. Let's get started with just talking about the most foundational topic we can, psychedelics through the female lens. And I think that we need to start with how female hormones impact our relationship with psychedelics, right? Leading to more challenging experiences that a male may encounter, and also bringing out what we instinctively have, which is the ability to nurture and collaborate. So I'm going to open this up to all panelists. Can you please talk about, how women's experiences with psychedelics can highlight empathy as a design principle because of our lived experience with psychedelics? I've learned so much from each. Everyone can. Yeah, I've learned so much from each of you about this, so I know one of you has something to say.
Mikaela, you go ahead.
I'll follow you. I'll follow you, Jennifer. Go ahead. You wrote the book on it.
You help. Yeah. So I think what April was getting at is that female hormones actually interact with our serotonin system. And so it's really important to consider that when we talk about psychedelics in general, and especially when we're thinking about females in this space. But essentially, our menstrual cycles occur along what's called the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. And this is why we have our follicular phase followed by ovulation, and then our luteal phase, and then we get our periods, right? And so we also have another axis in our bodies called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And this is concerned with our stress response. And when we are using something like psilocybin, which is obviously my specialty, obviously there are other psychedelics that act in similar ways, but psilocybin activates our serotonin receptors along that HPA axis, the one concerned with our stress response. And you can tell by their names that these systems overlap, these axes overlap. So if we are having a stressful time in our lives, that can impact our menstrual cycles. And likewise, our menstrual cycles can make us feel a little bit more stressed out depending on where we are at in our phases. And so estrogen, we know, affects binding at the serotonin receptor site. So that can also impact our journeys. And so what I'm learning from women in this space is that in many cases, more women are using some psychedelics a little bit more frequently than men are. And there tends to be a little bit of a difference in the way that women and men use psychedelics. And I don't mean to speak in binary terms. I do really mean assigned female at birth and assigned male at birth. But men tend to use psychedelics a little bit more recreationally, nothing wrong with that. But women are turning to psychedelics to self-treat. They're turning to psychedelics to self-treat for conditions that we're not getting adequate care in the medical system for. So an example of that might be, like, from my own perspective, endometriosis is something that I have. And then other conditions, including depression, anxiety, PTSD, other forms of trauma, chronic pain, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on and on. So women are turning to psychedelics to self-treat. But I think when we come to the psychedelic space, we bring this perspective of having a lot of empathy for other people who've gone through similar experiences where we're not getting this adequate care. Where I would like to see design kind of encompass that, or storytelling or anything like that, is that I think psychedelics in that space can seem abstract to many people, especially if you haven't had any experience with psychedelics or aren't familiar with them and you're maybe interested. It can seem inaccessible because what we often see in film and television is we see that the typical dude bro, right? I don't mean to be reductive about that, but like the typical dude bro having some sort of heroic journey, and they're tripping their balls off essentially, and things are going crazy and wild. And that doesn't really speak to the 40-something-year-old woman who's just trying to like live their lives and care for themselves in some way that is better than what they're getting, again, in the mainstream medical system. I'm thinking I just really want to see where we start to where design starts to bring, and storytelling starts to bring that empathy to the table, and we can present a different perspective of what psychedelics actually look like. And so for example, in my book, I really enjoyed sharing all the science about psychedelics, but bringing to the table a lot of storytelling about how psychedelics have helped shape women's lives in different ways, or change their lives and been really transformative. Again, just calling a shout out here to Mikaela, who shared some of her personal experiences with me, as well as her perspective on Indigenous wisdom. So very valuable things that she brought to the table for my book. And again, I think that all generates this empathy that we are looking for. So my point here is, let's get away from this sort of dude bro culture that is very, oh, we're just tripping our balls off over here, to something that's really accessible for, again, the average suburban mom out there who is busy and trying to take care of her life, but really struggling. So I'm going to turn it over to Mikaela.
Mikaela, yeah, I just want to summarize also. It sounds to me like you're talking about intentional use of psychedelics, that women are coming at this with a lot of intention.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mikaela?
Jennifer, I could not say all the science better myself. For the lay person, I will just break it down like this. We're seasonal beings, seasonal and cyclical. And so we have rises and falls, which is intrinsic to our relationship with the planet. Like the nature rises and falls. We are moving into the season of winter in the Northern Hemisphere, which gives us cues about how to respond to life, right? The internal seasons model, I think, is like a great way to just get a visual on that. Menstruation sometimes being winter being an allegory for menstruation, and then springtime being an allegory for pre-ovulatory phases, summer with ovulation, and then luteal with the fall, right? And so we can see that's nature happening all around us. We can see that it's happening inside of us, and we can take cues from that dance to choose strategically about where to place our experiences. Some people really acknowledge that certain parts of their cycle can bring a certain environment that might be conducive or not conducive to an entheogenic experience. And so what I want to say about how that relates to empathic care, empathic design, is to consider seasonality in people's lives and not pathologize like depression and so many things that are intrinsic to the human experience. Recognize that grief can come along with hormonal shifts, that the dying cycle is intrinsic to the human experience, and to also just visibilize people with hysterectomy, people that are
Mikaela, if you can hear us, we cannot hear you. You're frozen.
oh,
there you are. Yeah.
we're good.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think as practitioners and designers, to consider seasonality into how we live as businesses in this like hyper consumptive space that is also giving cues to the psychedelic community. We are also adopting some of these also hyper consumptive practices, like hyper like product right over process kinds of mentalities. And what I really want to name is that what Jennifer might be getting at here is that it doesn't take gender to acknowledge the earth is sacred. It doesn't take gender to acknowledge that there are limited resources here. But for the larger scope of humanity, mothers, aunties, caretakers of the home and hearth have been made responsible to manage resources, to manage how much we have, to track those things. That's part of our wisdom system, is to like track, trace, trial, error, report, keep things on record. And so not only is storytelling intrinsic to how we manage and care for the land around us and the homes around us, but it's how we cue to the next generations, how to maintain, conserve, and ensure the survival of life. And so what I will say is hyper-consumerism around the psychedelic space is not going to ensure the longevity of certain medicines that are a rarity. Amanita muscaria mushroom, for example, peyote, for example, ayahuasca, San Pedro. These things you can't cultivate under your bed like psilocybin mushrooms. I guess I'll land the plane here by saying that it's important to, as designers, facilitators, consider conservation, consider seasonality, and consider that you can receive access and get benefit from also being in proximity to medicine, being in the art created by medicinal experiences, being in the music created by medicinal experiences, being in the dance created by entheogenic experience. I like to teach as a folk herbalist that consumption is not the first and only way of relationship. And getting enmeshed in the culture, in the community, in the conversation, in the music and the art and the design of people journeying creating in the third dimension can also make a positive impact on people's lives as much as eating a bunch of mushrooms can, or a bunch of medicine can.
That thought really makes for a more expansive idea around the intersection of psychedelics and design, because I think when I hear that, I do think about consumption, right? And our consumption and what we create, or what design comes out of our experiences directly with the medicine. So thank you for broadening that definition. Yeah. Tiffany, do you have anything to add?
I love what the both of you just shared, and I was hoping that you would both step in first because I know that's your expertise within that space. So I love that. I would say, to add to it, what I really love that we're seeing more in the space now is even the research with clinical trials. That was, from my knowledge, more directly focused with a lot of men than women. Obviously, both were involved, but there was a higher percentage of men. So it is really beautiful to see a lot of this research now more inclusive with women. I know the both of you are doing some incredible research as well, specifically with mothers and postpartum and pregnancy. And that's such a topic of discussion in the space right now, as well as, can I microdose while I'm pregnant? Can I microdose postpartum? How long do I need to wait? How much do I microdose? What medicine do I work with? So many questions with women around that. And so I think in the beginning, years ago, I wouldn't say that's the beginning, but if we go back even just a couple years ago, those questions weren't really getting much attention. And so I love that there's women like you guys that have been stepping up and taking the lead on that and doing the research behind the scenes. So I'm excited to see that come out. I know that some's slowly coming out. Another thing that I would add with that too is women in leadership roles or women in business. That's my background. So of course that's going to come in, where a lot of the people that we work with are obviously in a culture of business. It's a culture that's typically stigmatized, male dominant. And so it's really amazing to now see how psychedelics are starting to bridge that gap, is what I'm finding, where all of a sudden there's so much more empathy, like we're speaking into. There's so much more compassion, connection, understanding. And a lot of that is what I'm seeing through a lot of the work that we're doing is it's breaking down the ego. It's breaking down the stigma of how it's always been, and are allowing new opportunities and new perspectives to come in that are really making a difference for a lot of the ways that people are leading and collaborating and driving innovative companies forward. Yeah.
Thank you, Tiffany. I think we should continue with that line of discussion around empathy in design, and how can organizations and individual designers embed empathy in products and services and service development. Do you expand on that? Yeah, go ahead, Mikaela.
As a graphic designer and content creator who pretty much was able to amplify most of my work in the days before there was hyper censorship in these social media platforms, like on TikTok, I used to be able to write hashtag psilocybin and exist. You cannot do that anymore. What empathy looks like for me in product design, education, is like accessible education. I'm talking like captions, like easy to read text, like things that people that are neurodiverse, that are receiving information in different ways can digest. Because truly, like end-to-end research papers is not, it's going to lose so many people. Like our brains don't digest, and not every brain digests information this way. And in design and product making, can it be beautiful? Can it be aesthetic? Can it be multimedia? Can it also have an audible component to it? Are there videos involved? Is the text legible? Do we get an eye break? How do I create something tangible for people that also is very sensory and soft? It's such a hard world that we live in sometimes. How do I express like the beauty of nature by pulling in my designs like local flora and fauna, as opposed to what's the coolest AI stock image I can pull, but instead pulling the organic of the environment that I'm like speaking in or am part of. So I think these are like tiny little things that skew to central nervous systems that like we are considering the sensory experience of design and the sensory experience. Like when I go to conferences, for example, even the design of spaces, would I even want to be with medicine in my system at a giant conference? Is there the cushy lounge? Is there like the place for me to write in my journal? Like, how are we thinking about, if we are going to talk about entheogens in this space, is this even a space I want to have entheogens in my system for? And a lot of times it isn't. So it would be nice to see a wraparound sensory experience for people that actually is very inviting for journeyers alike. And as far as when I create products, I find that it is so important for me as a practitioner to recognize and understand agency and sovereignty and the righteousness of personal use, and to not gatekeep. What I know is what the community deserves to know. And so free education guides, like not just writing my whole PDF so I can get your email, but like maybe making a video for you with things that you can learn at home, that I don't need to capitalize on my knowledge, but instead can hand it off freely in a beautiful way that feels I'm helping to increase the literacy in my community. For those companies out there, I'm seeing such beautiful things around, handheld little pamphlets that go with the product, right? So considering the design of the service along with the product is very valuable and important to me. And that products can be experiential and not just like a inanimate thing.
Yeah, we mentioned clinical trials earlier, and 25% of clinical trials, or 25% of the participants in clinical trials are women. A lot of these clinical trials are to address symptoms or our lives, how we move through the world if we're neurodivergent. And that's what I'm hearing. Is consider the neurodivergency of individuals when bringing education, product, services, to market.
Yeah.
Tiffany or Jennifer,
what's neuronormal anyway?
Exactly. Yeah.
So many
Sorry, I was
ways
going
of
to jump
going.
in
Like,
here.
let's just do that.
Yes, absolutely. I wanted to just jump in briefly and bring back something to the table that Mikaela had mentioned earlier, which is really safety and safe spaces and feeling safe and comfortable. And I think when someone is creating a product or a conference or designing anything related to psychedelics, we need to be talking to people who aren't just like us, right? So obviously talking to the LGBTQ community, that sort of thing. But when we're talking about like a cis white male creating some sort of space, a psychedelic space or product or whatever it is, they also need to be reaching out to those assigned female at birth and understanding what will make us feel the most safe in a community, a space, whatever it is, because we carry a certain amount of fear in our bodies from people violating our consent constantly in this world. And it's a big issue in the psychedelic space. And it's happening at conferences, it's happening at retreats and that sort of thing. So I want, as we move forward in the industry, to have these conversations a little bit more openly, and again, have these designers or the people that are in charge really talking to people to understand, how do you feel coming to one of these spaces and what are the hurdles for you?
Yeah, I would say we talk about collaboration as being an intrinsic feminine trait. And if you are a cisgender male that is looking to bring a service or product to market and you're uncertain as to how you can respect and speak to the needs of a woman, collaborate, bring someone in that you feel the women on this panel are a great place to start. Yeah. Tiffany?
Yeah, something that keeps coming to mind and is integrity and authenticity. And it's a little bit of a different approach. It's aligned with what you've been sharing, but a slight different approach of a lot of the companies that are popping up in the psychedelic space right now, and a lot of the leaders, CEOs, executives, what have you, of those companies, some of them have not ever worked with psychedelics, and they're bringing in this whole company, and it can be really harmful to the space and can be really harmful to the people that it's trying to reach. So that's one avenue. And then I love the topic that we're speaking into about the actual conferences themselves and just the space and the environment and how that can be welcoming and how that can really reach a broad audience. I really love that because I haven't really heard that being talked about much at all. And it's true. It's like, how do we want to feel and represent and also invite others into these co-collaborative spaces, but also these spaces to just learn more about psychedelics. And I think when we start to break down the layers and go underneath it all and go to the very root of it, it's like, how do these medicines want to be represented? How can we be inclusive? And I think if we bring back in white dominant and just the stigma around everything and how so much is tied up within money and greed and just, I don't know, there's a lot that I can go into with that, but it's like, how can we unravel that and break that down to where there's just a lot more of a different approach. It's not just about money and income and seeing what this space can be projected to be, and all the numbers that continue to come out in 2028, and it's 9.2 billion and it's this. And it's like, how can we just come back to the foundational place of, hey, we're here, we're all in this incredible movement together. We're in this generation where we have arrived today of we are the ones right now moving this forward. And how do we want to continue to come together in a way that is authentic, that is in integrity, and that is being served in the way that it wants to be?
Yeah, I think you're speaking to a topic that is in the zeitgeist this week with the execution of the CEO of United Healthcare, right? You're putting profits over people. There's a lack of compassion there. We're in late stage capitalism, and psychedelics is being mainstreamed at this time. So how do we learn from the mistakes of the healthcare industry when we too see ourselves as providing services and tools to help with one's health and well-being? Where do we insist on compassion and make sure compassion comes in at every step of the process within design and services? Are there checks and balances that you all use in your own process? I think, again, speaking to the intrinsic feminine value of compassion, right? It's probably just something that you do. There's not a manifesto that you've written on how can we do this? But I'd love to hear how you foster that within your teams too, if you yourself just naturally are a compassionate human.
I have a quick note on that, just from a journalism perspective. So in the journalism space, good public news publications and outlets, and also personal freelancers like myself, we tend to keep what are called audits. And these are diversity audits, essentially. So it helps me. It's just a spreadsheet, really, but it's like, who have I interviewed in my pieces, right? Have I only been reaching out to white male scientists? Is this white male scientists? Have I included the LGBTQ voice? And it's not that I'm trying to cherry pick, but it's more to keep myself in check with what I'm doing. And I think that really helps. And you can do that in all sorts of areas. It doesn't have to be just focusing on diversity, but just making yourself a really well-rounded person as a creator. And again, I just bring that to the table with the journalism space. And I do focus on diversity there, but also, am I telling stories that get to all communities, that sort of thing?
Yeah. Because as we said, storytelling is how we can start to share how the medicines are working for certain. This is all we've had in lieu of scientific data. Would either of you like to add anything, Mikaela, Tiffany?
Tiffany, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm just sitting with it a little bit more, just tuning into what approach, because there's a few that are coming in. But I think what kind of comes in initially is when we think of all the clinical trials and everything that are currently happening, that have happened, and the outcomes and where that can potentially outsource and support in all the different ways. I think the way that I view it, because I have a business hat on, but I also have a very much so like underground hat on. And when I think of that approach, those are two different very approaches, but they're all trying to land in the same trajectory, such as serving an individual that is looking for the resources and the support that they need for, you fill in the blank. And so the way that I've always viewed that is there's going to be a lot of people that the medicines serve in a more therapeutic clinical office setting, and that's going to reach and heal and support so many of the population. And then there's so many of these other people where it's going to reach them and serve them so much more in a indigenous, more so retreat, more coaching perspective. And I think to really land that, I think there's a place for it all, so long as there's integrity and authenticity, like what I was sharing before, and there's ethical, and there's so many things to bring in, consent and preparation and integration. And there's so many things to put into that perspective, regardless of how it's brought in whatever setting that it is. So I just want to bring that in because I don't think that it's one or the other. I think it's all inclusive so long as we continue to advocate and educate in the ways that are necessary to make sure that it is being served in a way that's ethical.
Yeah, I hadn't made that connection of what we spoke about earlier in terms of presenting information in a way that everybody can absorb in a way that's more natural to them. I also hear this talk to consumers, patients all the time. They're like, in fact, there was a podcast series that I listened to this summer on Vox, and it was a woman who had gone through the Lycos clinical trials, and the year following, she did not have, her mental health was not great, but she decided to try MDMA on her own with a friend, and she had a much better experience because she wasn't with therapists in a clinical setting. She was able to do it on her own terms. And to make space for, again, the not neurodivergency, but just like the what we need differs as because we are different humans. And right now, the system that's in place that we can legally operate in has a very clear path as to how we use this therapeutically. And what I think what we all see happening is reducing and decreasing the need for the therapeutic component in psychedelic medicine and figuring out how you just hand over the medicine to someone without this human connection to help them make sense of what's coming up. Mikaela, do you have anything to offer?
Yeah, I think what comes up for me about this like intrinsic collaborative function that has endured as part of like how our way of thinking and the way of being has evolved over these many millennia. I love to think back to like psychedelic grandpa Terence McKenna and his kind of hypothesis around how psilocybin may have influenced the development of human consciousness to gift us this like symbolic thinking, linguistical skill, compassionate skill sharing, collaborative natures. I think about people like Ryan Eisler, who wrote this incredible book called The Chalice and the Blade, and I think makes a really great distinction around not positioning gendered ways of thinking against each other, but instead looks at the world not in this binary of matriarchy good, patriarchy bad, and patriarchal ways of thinking bad, and matriarchy just like always peaceful all the time. Because I see women scrap like nobody business. We fight too, but she talks about dominator models and partnership models. And I absolutely love that distinction that we can have a mix of gendered, many-bodied ways of being that is in a partnership mentality, as opposed to a dominator mentality, or not even opposed to really, but like in relationship to people who think that fear-based or consequence-based, there are only fear-based and consequence-based ways of encouraging social order and social structures. And in partnership models, we are like pleasure-seeking little monkeys that like just want to go along. And so in the ways that I do like business and socializing and things like that is like, I love the art of recognizing that people in our space, even if doing similar things, are not in strict competition with one another. I think foundationally, the conversation around like women one-upping each other and like cattiness and shit like that, it's just boring and very tired. And I think we are clawing our way out of each other's hair and competitive natures. And instead, how am I doing this thing I'm doing in a way that is informed by my views and my skill sets? And how are you doing things similar in similar fields in a way that expresses your genius and your perspectives? And how do we like create a greater broad stroke here together with our skill sets? So I just love the art of putting each other on, that we speak each other's name at conferences, that we like shout our sisters' names to the rooftops. Oh, that's my homegirl. I will always support her. I will always, and being surrounded by each other. I know that Tiffany talks about like ethics and like maintaining a sense of peace in our community. That also means not just putting good people on game, but also letting our friends know when they've made mistakes too. because I think we're creating our own version of the old boys club. Like we are creating our own version of like our own little alliance of people that we think do great things in our space and have the realness to maybe say, hey, like this is feeling crunchy for me. Can we work this out? I cannot tell you how many business relationships I've had with other female collaborators where we've had a crunchy spot. It happens. And I think it's important to also prioritize relationship over business and prioritize, hey, maybe the business relationship needs to settle down so that we can focus on being community members. Tiffany was saying, how do conferences feel? Are conferences centering commerce or relationships and community? And for that is like the cultural revolution. I'm saying we get to have fun and make money, but that's not why we're here. We get to be friends and have fun and make money, but it's not like I'm just in the venture of making money in this and might make some friends along the way. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together.
I love that phrase. I've never heard it before. Thank you for sharing that. And again, I think that definitely speaks to the collaborative way that women have been forced to work together when we are in business because we don't raise the capital that men raise. And we are perhaps not in the highest decision-making roles, right? So to make that impact, it's the power in numbers. Yeah, we're going to open up the floor to questions from our audience really soon. So I want to make sure that if there are any thoughts that you all would like to share, we do that before we start taking questions from the audience.
I
Final
have one
thoughts.
more thing I wanted to add, and this is really just about empathy and psychedelics in general and how psychedelics can help us generate empathy, which I think is really important to this conversation. Anyone who's familiar with the psychedelic space will have heard of the default mode network before. It's a network of brain regions that work together to form our sense of self, but it's also this way that we tap into empathy, because without this sense of framing about how would I feel in someone else's shoes or like our own storytelling, we have trouble tapping into empathy. So that default mode network is really important for empathy. With psilocybin and other psychedelics, we can temporarily change the default mode network. So parts that normally connect will disconnect, and parts that aren't normally connected will connect. And this can give us this sort of super amplified sense of empathy. So for people designing psychedelic spaces or just design in general to promote a product, whatever it is, obviously like a psychedelic journey can really help with that. But I also want to point out that there's a really practical way to do this too. So if it's not feasible for you to do journeys regularly to tap into that empathy or creativity, we can actually activate our default mode network without mind-altering substances, which is actually a really important thing to consider. So we can do this just by letting our minds wander. So if you think about the default mode network is actually really super active when you're thinking about your internal world. If you're journaling or reading a book or just letting your mind wander. And it's less active when you're doing things like a physical task, or I shouldn't say a physical task, but doing something that's like labor intensive with your brain, like sending work emails, filing taxes, that sort of thing. Or even when you're actively creating the product that you're working on or design that you're working on. So you may have noticed that like when you have some of your best epiphanies when you're in the shower, when you're out on a hike or something like that. For me, it's like when I'm out running in the woods and I'm not even doing anything that is the creative process, but we can actually go and do those things and then tap into the empathy consistently by tapping into our default mode network every day by just letting your mind wander. And then that creative process will follow in a natural way. And empathy will really be at the root of that. But I'll stop there because I know we got to end.
Thank you. I think that is an extremely important point to add to this conversation, particularly the fact that you don't need to imbibe in order to reduce your ego and increase empathy. I don't see any questions. Maybe I think I'm doing this right, but I would like to take questions from the audience. If you have any, there's a Q&A function within Zoom where you can type in your question. And I'll also look in the chat to see if anyone's added anything there. I don't see. Okay, Jennifer, This is from Montreal Mushroom Festival audience member. Jennifer, could you please throw a bit more light on how psychedelics affect women differently compared to men from a neuropharmacological perspective? Thanks so much in advance. Much love and gratitude.
Yeah, that is a really great question. So again, psilocybin and other psychedelics do interact with our menstrual cycle. And so it may matter where we are in our journey, where we are in our menstrual cycle when we do a journey or how we engage with microdosing. So I brought in Mikaela, actually was a huge part of this part of the book where I interviewed her about indigenous wisdom practices and when we use psychedelics during the menstrual cycle, like where's the best time? How do we use microdosing strategies for that? And so I think this can have really important applications for if we're managing conditions that are impacting the menstrual cycle, something like premenstrual dysphoric disorder, polycystic ovary syndrome, endometriosis, menopause, perimenopause, postpartum depression. All of these things play a role. So in the book, I have this like giant chapter 11, which I felt like I would never finish writing, but I incorporated like all these different conditions that psilocybin may be able to help with, and then bringing in that indigenous wisdom perspective from Mikaela to help tie mainstream science with indigenous wisdom, because indigenous wisdom is something that we actually have more knowledge from. We can pull more knowledge from. Yes, we have the science, and that's this process of doing something over and over to reproduce the same results, but that's what indigenous communities have done for thousands of years. And so they can work together. And so that was my goal with that chapter. So there's a lot of information there that may be able to answer your question a little bit better.
So we have a question from Kelly. Thank you, Jennifer, on more thoughts on product design and messaging. There's not clarification here of whether it's being from the female perspective or speaking to women. But do you all have any thoughts on messaging and product design? The first thing that comes to mind for me is it's not pink it and shrink it. I learned that really in cannabis. And also the messaging is getting in the head of a woman. What's her day-to-day like? Why is she, what are the need states that she's looking for with these medicines, and making sure that she understands how to use it correctly so that she has a great experience and isn't scared off because she doesn't understand what Mikaela has shared with us. There's a monthly cycle and a lifetime cycle that we need to take into consideration with our hormones. And I have another question so if you have anything to add, great. I just want to make sure we have 3 more minutes to answer questions. Juliana asks, what do you feel would be an ideal design around business and psychedelics? What do you feel are the current challenges that inhibit the vision or a vision?
I can take that. Yeah. I would say my suggestion would be to really get present and take the time with your own self of what your vision is for what you're wanting to create. I think there's a lot of similarities that are happening in the space. If you look at microdosing coaches and just everything that's popping up within that, everyone's saying the same thing and doing it in their own little ways. But I think if you can come in and bring an approach that's very unique to you while also informing and educating yourself on the ethical ways to go about protocols, or if it is microdosing, it's probably not, but just to give an example, what the business is actually about, the foundations of it. But I think overall, it's more so coming from you. What do you want to create as a business? What feels most true, authentic, and integrity with you, and how you want to drive that forward? Because if it's somebody else's idea or someone else's copy or whatever the thing is, you may foundationally enter the psychedelic space, and then months down the road, it's not feeling good because it's not yours, it's not authentic to you. So that would be my suggestion. I'm happy to build upon that, because I think there's a lot of different angles that we can take with that if you have more questions around it.
This is a comment for Mikaela from an anonymous attendee. I actually teared up when you brought to light those of us who process differently and have practitioners and designers keep that in mind. I wanted to share that with the group. Another question, how do we normalize conversations about ethnobotany, psychedelic therapy? How do we overcome the trust of pills over plants? Good one. I think that's a difficult one to overcome, and perhaps in one generation. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I love this question. I love this question because I'm a folk herbalist. I grew up, sorry, I was just talking to my mom actually just now. So I grew up in my mom's kitchen. And as you said, it might take generations and it takes modeling. It takes modeling. But I'm so glad to see that the conversation around pulling from the local flora and fauna to be helpful, even like people going to farmers markets, people thinking about food sovereignty, people thinking about, hey, is it actually easier for me to walk around my neighborhood and pull a juniper berry than go drive to the CVS and try to find something? But a lot of people don't know. A lot of people do not know what's in their neighborhood. A lot of people have been largely removed many generations ago from any kind of herbal knowledge. And so, what I will say is, herbalism isn't that hard. And getting connected to a lot of us do herbalism. If anyone put black pepper in their food, they are already doing herbalism. Consider more than you think. And how long is it going to take for us to trust like one system over the other? What I will say is that they don't oppose one another either. As an abortion advocate, I'm a very plants, pills, and practices type of girl. And is the misoprostol and mifepristone going to be supported by the
Mikaela, you've frozen again. I don't know if we can do anything about that. So Mikaela's frozen. I know that we are now over our deadline. I will answer questions in the Q&A separately that we didn't get to, but I look forward to also listening to the rest of the panels for the day. Thank you, Jennifer, Mikaela, and Tiffany for your thoughts.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Abel, thank you so much. And Jennifer, Tiffany. Oh, yeah, Mikaela, you're still there. Thank you all so much
Thank
for
you.
participating. We'll take about a 4 or 5 minute break, and then we'll be back for next session on cultivating safe spaces, enhancing human potential in regenerative environments. I will see everyone in a few minutes.